And to our colleagues, good morning. I'll skip the formalities in the interest of time and move right ahead with the presentation. So what I'm about to do this morning is to give you an overview for those of you who may not know the specific details of the EcoAgriCulture Project. I'll attempt to do that very quickly, and then we'll move into the results of the project and what we've been able to accomplish in these two target areas. Okay, so as indicated by my colleagues before, the northern... Oh goodness, this thing seems to be going crazy. All right, good. So I'm here now. Right, so the Northern Range assessment pointed to a number of things that agriculture, among other activities in Northern Range watersheds, contributed to the degradation of the ecosystems there through unsustainable land clearing practices, farming on steep slopes without erosion protection or soil conservation practices, overuse of inorganic chemicals on farms, affecting the water quality of our rivers and streams and quality through pollution, erosion, etc., sedimentation, affecting the biodiversity of our freshwater species or soil organisms and also our terrestrial organisms. And in fact, the long-term sustainability of this type of what we call conventional farming is in fact questionable. But what are the options for managing this type of agriculture? Relocation of farmers out of the Northern Range is not a very feasible option, and there's an image of some protest here, not necessarily in the Northern Range, but recently pineapple lands issue. It's not politically attractive either, so no politician will take this on board. With land development pressure, confining agriculture to flatter areas of the Northern Range is also not a very feasible option. So strict soil conservation measures and incentives to institute soil conservation and cultivation in a manner that is sustainable are in fact our best options. So hence the EcoAgriCulture Project. In 2009, the Multilateral Investment Fund of the IDB approved a grant of US $150,000 to fund a project for the implementation of sustainable farming practices. The goal of this project is to promote alternative farming practices in the Maracas Valley and Caura areas, and specifically to improve the returns and sustainability of small-scale agriculture on elevated slopes, and also to mitigate the negative impacts on the environment and affected downstream communities. So those are the specific goals of the project, and I encourage you to keep those in mind as we go through the day. So at the end of the day, you can reflect on those and comment on whether we have in fact achieved those. So the EcoAgriCulture Project is executed by the Cropper Foundation, and project management duties also sit within the Cropper Foundation. We have been guided throughout the project by a steering committee comprising a number of different agriculturally related institutions, including the Ministry of Food Production, CARDI, UE, ECA, etc. And the technical day-to-day running of the project has been undertaken by our technical coordinator, Dr. Alan Williams, and he is supported by a technical consultation team, Dr. Shango Alamu, Berman Celestin, and Richard Guy, who couldn't be here today. So the main project activities, the EcoAgriCulture project activities, have been built on principles of participation and information sharing, realizing that these are absolutely critical to what we were attempting to do. So we're not attempting to go into the two areas and say, all right, come around the table, this is what we want you to do. No, in fact, it was more of a, what are your needs? These are the things we have to offer, and the confluence of those things were what we were most interested in. So activities were designed to facilitate collaborative learning and decision-making among stakeholders. The first major activity was the baseline assessment undertaken in March to July 2010, and this was to better understand what are the farming conditions in these two areas. What are the farming activities undertaken? What are some of the practices that are undertaken? This gives us an idea of what we need to address specifically, who's doing what already. Community organizational assets, and these were found to be things like the farmers' organizations, the village councils, different stakeholder groups who operate outside of the valley but do support work in the valley, livelihood prospects aside from agriculture that do compete with agriculture, and then important landscape features in these specific areas. And just to note, we have printed copies of all of our reports on that side table there. So during the lunch break, feel free to browse through, because I cannot capture all of the information in my presentation this morning. And there is a lot that is contained in those reports. We held our first stakeholders workshop in November of 2010. Objectives were to introduce the project details to stakeholders, present the findings of the baseline study, to present the key aspects of the project's options for implementing sustainable farming practices, to bring our stakeholders around the table to begin discussing and to get some feedback into what it is we were planning to do, and really to secure the buy-in of our stakeholders. And we did this through a priority setting exercise, where we looked at different priority options for individual farmers, for collaborative actions, and for options for getting better services from the project and from extension, etc. And what we found was that the responses to these options were generally good, and farmers were hesitant to, 1, setting up demonstration plots on their farms, 2, private farm investments in hillside stabilization, and promoting indigenous species. So having these in mind, we were aware of some of the challenges that we needed to overcome, and we understood what sort of transformation that was needed to bring farmers from being hesitant about those things to being more accepting of some of these things. The intervention model. Now, what this was, it was really a prerequisite for the development of the intervention strategies for these specific target areas. And this built on the baseline assessment and really delved into the communities to find out what are the things that we need to address if we're talking about implementing sustainable farming practices. Now, this thing isn't simply about the farming practices. They are done in a context of people's lives and their livelihoods. So there are things that we needed to understand. For example, the governance structures of the different organizations that exist in the community, and that we needed to build up the governance in these organizations. Training and empowerment was needed not only for these organizations, but also for farmers. On-farm participatory research needed to be encouraged. A review and analysis of the work that we're doing. So continuously reviewing the work and encouraging farmers to question, critically analyze the work that they themselves are engaged in towards finding better solutions. Testing and application of research findings among a broad mass of practitioners. So here's where we talk about scaling up out of the 2 communities and involving more farmers, and promotion to enhance broader adaptation of the initiative. Selecting the farmers for participation took place in January of 2011, and how we had a set of established criteria that included a farmer needed to indicate a high level of interest and willingness to participate in the project, of course, a high level of interest or willingness to share knowledge. So as much as we are encouraging farmers to share knowledge with us, we encourage farmers to share knowledge among themselves, because this is a key and critical aspect of the sustainability of the initiative. And then farmers who indicate a strong commitment to continue with the proposed farming methods beyond the end of the project. So the project ends in January 31st, and what we were looking for were a set of farmers who were interested in, all right, I'm going to take this up on myself, and I'm not going to depend wholly and solely on the Cropper Foundation and the project partners to do this thing. So really looking for farmers who had that aspiration or who had that capacity to aspire to do their own thing. And then we had a benefit package, which was developed out of our understanding of what were the farmers' needs and support to transition to more sustainable farming practices. And these benefits included information on better farming practices, learning to manage the farm in the context of the environment around you, understanding that you farm in a landscape with others, understanding that you farm in a landscape that is of high nature value, learning new techniques to reduce on-farm input costs and increase productivity, trying out new technologies on your farms, and then an opportunity to use part of your farm through an agreement between yourself and the foundation and project partners as a demonstration plot. So in terms of numbers, Out of 38 farmers we identified in the Maracas St. Joseph area, we were able to interview 18 of those, and out of 28 in the Caura area, we were able to interview 16 of those. Our second stakeholders workshop was held in May of this year. The objectives forgot we're in 2012, of last year, to introduce the concept of farming in a high native value environment. And we spoke about the high native value index this morning. Some persons touched on it, and we wanted to introduce this as well as a key tool in our intervention. We wanted to demonstrate the background information that we could offer to farmers in developing the strategies for implementing the sustainable farming practices. Again, to provide a forum and an opportunity for sharing and discussion on strategies for implementing the sustainable farming practices. And then finally, to collectively determine the material support that would be made available to farmers engaged in adopting or readjusting to sustainable farming practices. And just as a side, we were able to raise $20,000 US in support from the FAO for purchase of materials to support farmers in this transition to sustainable farming practices. Oh goodness, sorry. So the high native value indexing exercise took place between April and May of last year. And what the high native value index is, it's really a program, it's a mechanism that was developed principally by the technical coordinator with support from the rest of the project team for incorporating environmental concerns into a farmer's assessment of personal risk, production security, and perceived threats. So what this index really helped us to do is change the way that, or it has the potential really to change the way that farmers think about farming in the environment, realizing again that they're in a high native value environment, and with farming in a high native value environment comes a certain amount of responsibilities that you must take on. So the high native value index promotes the idea, as I alluded to before, that we are farming in a high native value environment, and therefore it deserves special attention. And secondly, the index provided a relative determination of how eco-friendly a farmer's practices were based on 4 variables: the local pest and disease pressure, agronomic practices, fertilizing practices, and how the farmer manages crop growth. So we asked the farmer 8 questions that related to farm location, land use, crop management, agronomic practices, etc., types of inputs used, and scores were allocated based on responses. So the way how the index scores is that the closer you are to 100, the more you are farming in an eco-friendly way. Yeah, that's it. And the further you are from 100, of course, there are some things that you are doing, or there are a lot of things that you are doing that are not considered eco-friendly and could in fact be harmful to the environment and harmful to your farm. So in terms of the indexing exercise, a lot of the farmers who were engaged in this exercise, and it was 30 farmers from both areas, scored below 60. And this is not to say that farmers were not engaged in doing the right thing in some cases. It's just that the way how the index was designed, it's very sensitive to negative practices. So heavy use of NPK fertilizers and others, fast stack and pest stack and all that sort of thing, were picked up by the machine, and it brought farmers' scores down. And in fact, in interacting with farmers, many of the farmers who consider themselves successful using conventional methods found that the high native value index had recalibrated the way how they thought about their success, and it helped them to identify their practice and the way they go about farming as more of a resource appropriating type practice as opposed to a resource sustaining type practice. And sustaining is what we're looking to get towards. And very importantly, what the index helped us to do was to really engage farmers in this discussion as to how you can improve your farming practices so that they have a more ecologically friendly bent. And this was an important aspect of the intervention exercise. So on-farm interventions, and when we say on-farm interventions, we really talk about the exercise where we worked with farmers on a one-on-one basis to implement the specific sustainable farming practices. Now, feeding into these on-farm interventions was the baseline assessment, the intervention model, the high native value indexing exercise, and very importantly, discussions with farmers. So on-farm interventions took place in the last cycle of the project from July to December of last year, and a technical team was convened to work on a one-on-one basis with farmers in both areas to, one, determine their current status in terms of farming activities, to share the HNVI scores and to open discussion with the farmers, to discuss farming plans with the farmers. So what we were really trying to do is to encourage them to start documenting plans as well, because there's importance in this documentation. To offer the farmers information packages on a range of eco-friendly farming plans and practices, to offer the material inputs, to aid in the transition to sustainable farming practices, determine and implement the specific plans for incorporating the sustainable farming practices, and a bit of field monitoring and evaluation by the participating farmers and also by the technical team. Now you see, when I put up the first slide, 6 months to do the implementation exercise. I saw a couple eyebrows raised, and this is something that we will point to as we go throughout the day, that the time really for this implementation was really too short. So things like field monitoring and evaluation really needed a longer time frame, because here we had farmers, rainy season come, they're planting new things, they're trying the new methods, but in terms of evaluating those evaluations aren't really going to come until this year, early part of this year, all the way into March, April, that sort of thing. So it speaks to the need for continuance of the effort. So in terms of the Caura Valley intervention, so from the 28 farmers, we came down to 8 farmers, a drastic drop, who engaged specifically in the implementation of sustainable farming practices. And this is not to say that we had not engaged the other farmers in sharing information and things like that, but these were the farmers who we identified with the ones who really took on the practices. Of those 8, 6 showed strong interest in good eco-friendly farming practices. 6 used some sort of on-farm generated inputs, so things like the green manure, for example. Some used mulching. All 8 farmers use some sort of ecologically friendly external farm inputs. Cured manure was one of the common inputs. Contrasting, all 8 farmers used some sort of non-ecologically friendly farm inputs, and to varying degrees. Some used a whole lot, totally conventional, really believed in this thing, but then some used just a little bit, just to take care of that little batchak problem that they're having that's really taking down their citrus plants. Right? And we found that the majority of farmers were willing to use inorganic farm inputs. And all 8 farmers had their soils tested by the Ministry of Food Production Research Department. And I think this was a really commendable effort, having the soils tested, because we know how difficult it is to get this process. In fact, there's a backlog at the ministry. So getting the farmers engaged in this was something that we were very pleased about in this project. And we'll talk about the Maracas intervention. And in fact, we have a video that highlights some of the successes in Maracas, which we will show after, that form part of the sharing of results. So in terms of, so those were the main activities of the project. In terms of project performance, one of the objectives that had been outlined at the start of the project, one of the quantitative objectives, was that there would be 20% or more farmers in the 2 farming communities who were implementing sustainable farming practices. And what we found, based on the farmers that we were able to interact with, and keep this in your minds as well, based on the farmers that we were able to interact with, 56% of farmers in the Caura Tacarigua area were found to be implementing the sustainable farming practices, and 67% of farmers who we were able to engage with in Maracas were found to be implementing the sustainable farming practices. The project, of course, was not without its share of challenges. Identifying all of the farmers in the area proved to be a major challenge and really resulted in delays in the project execution. For three main reasons. There are persons who are farming in the two areas who do not live in those areas. So identifying and contacting those farmers was a real challenge. And in fact, to date, there are some farmers whose farms we recognize, but we are not able to identify who the farmers are. Not everyone who farms identifies themselves as a farmer. Particularly in Maracas, a lot of farmers undertake farming as a part-time activity. So in the time that they're not farming, they're doing something else. And some of these farmers choose not to identify themselves as a farmer. So maybe we need to redefine this farmer term and really use a more loose definition of those who practice farming, perhaps. And we found that there was a mismatch between the farmers identified by the farmers' organizations and the extension services of the Ministry of Food Production. So bringing these lists together and identifying all of the farmers proved to be a bit of a challenge. Delays in project execution were due to some extenuating circumstances, particularly in 2010, the extensive dry season of 2010, widespread forest fires, and of course our national elections. The design of the intervention model we found had to be extended by 6 months to adequately capture the information needed and to further interact with farmers. And this again speaks to the sheer amount of time it takes to engage farmers, to secure buy-in towards moving towards where we were able to get farmers to, right? And this is a crucial component, and this is a lesson learned for us in project design, that working with communities, and farmers are identified as one of these communities, we cannot simply say that we are attempting to transform in a major way farming practices in a mere 2 years. These farming practices are cultural, right? And it does take time to change the culture, to change the mindset, to present a set of different options, and to change the view of the farmer, to reorient the view of the farmer and help him to think differently, help him to see different options for farming in a more sustainable way. So in conclusion, for this part of the presentation, the project objectives were met, but there is still a significant amount of work that needs to be done towards mainstreaming sustainable farming practices in these areas, and then when we talk about scaling up the approach into other areas. As I said before, this intervention, the interaction with the farmers, etc., building up the relationships, set the stage for future work with farmers in adopting sustainable farming practices, and it therefore behooves us to move quite quickly to continue working with farmers through another project and to think about establishing a program so we can move away from this project by project basis and start to think more along a program basis. And sustainability, of course, is a question if we don't consider some of these things. So that